reasons. One of them being that Wellington was where our founding fathers actually first came to. And they fled for their faith from Europe, came to Wellington, and essentially in a very unfortunate incident in which fear and self-defense led to the loss of 2 innocent lives with no bad intent, led essentially to a certain level of alienation from the land and having to move. Now that has been prayed through and reconciled for many years deliberately through many of our family members. So it's not as if there's a sense of woundedness or a burden on the land, but this is the very, very first opportunity that I've ever had to speak in the vicinity of this land. And if you came through Wellington, you crossed 3 of our family farms we used to have originally: Champagne, Olifanhout, and Versailles. And Versailles actually is the French word for bride with reference to land. It's a land whose weeds have been removed and is rendered serviceable. Now, the beauty of how this has all been brought together amazes me. And the preparation just to be here has been a tremendous process for me. So I really want to thank you for being here. Thank you for the privilege of being here. And when the question time comes, I'm not sure that I would know how to answer, but the chances are very good that I'll know the question. So just please feel absolutely free. Now, Cassie told me not to apologize, which meant 2 things. The one is to really, really elaborate everything, and the other thing is to really explain what went wrong. Apologize means both, so I'll try to do neither. I know that you've had a wonderful, wonderful lead into this point, and therefore I hope, seeing that I would not be familiar with everything that has happened through this week, I trust that the Lord will lead, that what I add today will really build that picture, because one of the things that I really enjoy is big frameworks. Joining, the closest pebble to the furthest star, and sometimes I need to really, really just realize that we need to share with each other so that we are all able to digest. And please forgive me if my bridges are too far. I will give you reference points if you want to go back and have a look. Cassie said something interesting, that the first time he met me was when he didn't have an opportunity to talk to me. Well, the first time I met him, I sat for an hour, 20 minutes, completely silently on an airplane on the way to Durban. And I knew exactly who he was, and that he was actually reading something about fathering. And there was every reason to talk, and I had absolutely no sense of permission that I should. And I have marveled about that since it happened. And I thought, but you had every reason to talk years ago. And so how interesting that we both met each other in the other silence. So lovely to meet you. Okay, so moving on. Context. My wife Lucy is a nurse, and our daughters. Our first adopted daughter Renee, second biological daughter Millicent, and I'll explain why I'm mentioning that. And third, adopted daughter, and I'll explain that too. There is a wonderful process of growing and learning. And as a friend told me this week, it's sometimes quite hard for children to grow up their parents. We know that the reverse is certainly something we want to do. But the paradoxes are sometimes really, really useful. Now, I am not an expert. And one of the things doctors default to is to use Greek to communicate the ignorance, or Latin, to push. So we come up with these words in order to somehow put something, you call something a dog, but you don't know what it likes to eat or why it wags its tail, but it is a dog. So I need to confess also that we as medical doctors sometimes name things we don't understand. And using words like erythema multiforme sounds so much better than weird-looking red spots, doesn't it? So please don't feel in any way intimidated and very much encouraged to ask any question that's on your heart. I do work at the University Tygerberg campus in a field which requires more explanation than we have time for, but it involves the extremes of pressure. So essentially flying, if you like, and diving, plus the use of pressure in the form of a therapy for surgical patients that are often referred to us. So that is the context in which I am 2 to 3 days a week. And I have the privilege of being involved with some research activities, although I don't have a faculty appointment, and you know, I'm not a professor. That's one thing I wanted to correct. I'm not a professor, but I hope I'm sincere. If you hear what I'm saying. So professing in a certain sense means to think you know. Well, what I'd really like to encourage you from my side is permission to ask, and I think that is the attitude. Now, in asking, I have had the privilege of being part of a study effort to see how a week like this, that you're undergoing now, being together, sharing each other's company, and really working through studying, learning, praying together, how it transforms people. And we had the privilege of actually measuring that using different aspects and self-assessment scales. And we were able to show not only could you, on using what we would call research instruments, that people changed, but that the change was permanent. And then that good change was at the level of character, traits. In other words, not I'm afraid, not I'm anxious, I am a worried person. Those things changed. That was impressive. Surely we would know to think it could happen, but it's really, really wonderful to see that it really does. So that was a privilege. An invitation, I have a website. If you'd like to make contact, I'd encourage you to do that. There are resources there under a category called Wholeness that you could look up if you want. On some of the slides that are being recorded, there are links that would allow you to get to some of the original resources and papers. And if I don't have a chance to really dwell on anything now, I just want to assure you that I'd love to share those resources with you and to work these things through together. There's some recordings, as Cassie suggested, and they're also available open on YouTube. Okay, so a bit of the medical history. If we were to summarize medical history, 2000, before the arrival of our Lord manifested on earth, 2000 BC, the style of healing was, here, eat this root. Then we moved to know that root is heathen, say this prayer. Then, in 1850, around when everything was being challenged, that prayer superstition, drink this potion. And then in the 1960s, when a lot of medicines, as it were, became formalized and studied, it was the potion as snake oil, you know, have this pill. And then, more recently, the pill is ineffective, have this powerful, powerful, super specialized, purified medicine. And now, new millennium, where that's artificial, eat this root. So I can tell you from a medical point of view, there has been a tremendous drift and recalibration as we have pursued cure and healing with different styles of approach. And I'll contrast those towards the end. Now, I do want to, just from a very, very basic point of view, affirm everything that you have heard in terms of the effect of blessing, speaking life, etc., down to its effects on water's structure. So somehow we are talking about how people may be influenced physically once they're conceived, But I can tell you that experimentally, at the level of very, very careful scientific observation, intention and blessing has a measurable effect on how water behaves. So this is on a verifiable level, and in fact, this experiment from that laboratory was 2,000 people having a positive attitude towards some water, essentially between Tokyo and California, in a shielded electromagnetic room, with other beakers of water elsewhere in the world. And 2,000 people simply had a positive feeling, if you like, or intention towards this water in California. And that water was affected, and all the neglected water was not. Thanks. So, what is that? Well, we could look at that as psychic and all these other things that we might have concerns about, and that is not the point that I'm making. The point that I'm making is that our intentions, our expressions, our words have a measurable impact on the environment, to the extent that outside of any religious setting, outside of any specific framework of attitude, there was an influence on creation, which is part of the dignity that we've been given in being in this creation. So I want to affirm that the principles of blessing apply measurably at the most basic molecular level that we at the moment are able to look at. So if that's reassuring, that's what my intention was. If it sounds scary and creepy, I really didn't mean it in that way. Okay? It's just we have an impact, we have an opportunity. And we're talking at a molecular level, not even, how the impact would be later on in life. The slide is acting up. Okay. While we have a pause, it's really been a very, very interesting process. I would say in 2006, there was an incident in which I was medically incapacitated for a period of time, and had to go through the process of being medicalized, or at least put it in a hospital for the surgery that ultimately I received on my back. And in that period of time, I really felt somewhat reoriented, put it that way. And eventually I had to go to the neurosurgeon that I absolutely hated, because he didn't agree with the therapy that I was providing in the practice on the same premises, and yet was the only one I trusted. It happened that he did a procedure on me that was very, very meaningful, and we were both surprised at the end and became friends after that. And in one of the most memorable moments, when I was essentially unable to even fulfill my most basic responsibility, if you understand what I mean. In other words, not even able to go to the bathroom, but essentially being completely vulnerable in that moment of not even having taken care of my most basic responsibility, and in fact, smelling something that I thought couldn't be alive, if you understand what I mean without being too graphic, and waiting with dread in the room for a nurse or someone to come in and have to clean me, and waiting for the judgment in the eyes, the rolling of the nose, as I would probably have done if it were me. And this very, very basically trained assistant nurse walked in and whistled as she worked, maybe not to breathe in through the nose, I don't know, but whistled as she worked, and approached me without any sense of shame and condemnation. And one of the greatest shifts in my heart happened in that contact point between the most lowly trained, if you look at it from a staffing point of view, the most lowly trained individual in the hospital, and probably or possibly one of their most prestigious, in terms of how to practice in the hospital, patient. So I also want to say that the contact between people is often where it happens. whether it's one vehicle of connection or another, whether it's root, or whether it's pill. I've seen the Lord meet people over carrots and chemotherapy, if you understand what I mean. And I become far, far more guarded in my judgments on these things, because the Lord has been very deliberate in showing me an exception to all the rules I made, to show me the heart He rules from. You hear what I'm saying? Okay. All right, I hope that we are underway. I think we've covered the strategies in medicine to the extent of saying that the focus of the disease essentially wants us to either poison, destroy, remove, or whatever is causing the disease, or wanting to somehow promote the body's ability to respond better, or to interrupt the connection between the two, the body and whatever this process is. So those are strategies. It's not only a matter of, well, this is better than that. All of them can have the flow through the tree of life. All of them can be choking on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you hear what I'm saying. Is it an extension of God's mercy? Is it something that is a barrier to His hand? Well, that is a more complicated equation than we might necessarily think. So there are different styles, and I'm not promoting any particular style, other than to say that you can have the same wrongful attitude about how you eat your vegetables in fear, because you have to get your this and that, you have to get your that, versus I have to have this or that. So I think, heart's attitude is a very important thing to look at. Now, of course, it is true, and this is what this conference to some extent is about, is how emotions, how spiritual influences manifest in creation. And we need to be thoughtful of those. You'll have a chance, the links are there, so please just get the big picture rather than be concerned about the details. This is a discussion invitation. Now, from a medical point of view, one of the strategies that has happened in this desperate attempt to provide funding for therapy, what should be right in society, let me say that again, for funding in therapy, in other words, providing a medical environment to make up for what's broken at home, which is not financially viable. One of the strategies has been to come up with what has been called evidence-based medicine. But evidence-based medicine, in this definition that has been made about it, is based on the clinician's ability to have confidence in what they do, to there to be demonstration or evidence that it actually works, but also that the patient has confidence in the process. Now, the clinician, the competence of the clinician is important, and assurance that this is actually true is also important, because you can be sincerely wrong. We have all experienced that too. But the patient's confidence in the process is also important. And so what we put forward as evidence-based medicine, I would say, is really confidence-based medicine, which is really a form of saying it's faith-based, right? Everybody needs to be confident, and it must be actually true, at least to the level that we understand. And that is where medicine went in the struggle to fund the health crisis globally, whether it's poverty crisis driven or whether it's affluent misbehavior driven. There is a crisis on both sides of the scale. Now, because it's so difficult to essentially classify and treat everything, particularly broken hearts, there has now been a more functional approach. In other words, we know that there are things going on underneath. There are common ways in which that becomes disrupted, And ultimately, if that process carries on long enough, we see the fruit of it. And so it's very, very important to lay the roots. It is important to understand the common ways in which they might move forward and affect health. And eventually, when it becomes so visible that it is essentially a distraction, well, then you need people that are focused on that particular area to intervene. But it is so much better to deal at root level, which ultimately may become fruit level. It's not to say that the specialists that work on the fruit of particular disturbances of the body are the most important. They're just the most visible. What you are doing, essentially, is the most foundational difference that can be made. So I want to urge you and encourage you, and I would say that being a layperson is really an advantage, because you don't have your heads in the way of the obedience that you're called to. And often, I would tell you that as we think about it, we sometimes do. And I would have to admit, from my own perspective, that I have been dismayed at how my predictions of someone who is likely to die because they are really in an extreme situation. It's obvious, all the evidence is there, that the Lord almost defiantly, in the best sense of the word, makes them, or allows them, or heals them. And so I am really, really so submitted in the process of not knowing more than I have responsibility for in that moment. So that's just from a personal level. Now, it is true that not only our brain learns, our immune system learns as well. So it's not only memories that we have and process in our head that is stored. It's stored in lymph glands, it's stored in various parts of the body, and it can be trained just like we focus on sort of people's minds, brains. So it's true for the immune system. In fact, if you transplant people's hearts, then about 20% of them undergo a seeming change of personality. In about 20% of cases, that represents the personality of the donor, not the recipient. Now, how and why that happens, that is a matter of debate. That it happens, I think, is a very important thing to think about. Is it the person being kept alive by the other person's heart, or the heart being kept alive in someone else's body? It gets complicated. At the end of our chromosomes, there are, almost like the tassels on the prayer shawls in Israel, you know, that culture, there are little strings that are called tzitzit on the prayer shawl. Now, our chromosomes are almost, if you look at them, almost exactly the same. You have these dark stained bands, you have a lot of light stained bands, and you have these little threads at the ends of the chromosomes. They're called telomeres. And you know what? The length of those telomeres on our chromosomes determine the number of our days. Because as they get shorter, the chromosomes can't be copied, because the printer or the copier can't get far enough to read everything. The telomeres, the tassels, the tzitzit, the fringes, whatever translation you're used to, that is where the length of days for an individual on their chromosomes is based. So can you imagine how significant it is for the woman with the issue of blood to reach out and touch the Lord's fringes? Can the Lord write a script? It's very impressive. So I marvel how the Lord does things. And my burning bush experience, you know, the fascination that draws me in, may not be your burning bush. But when Moses responded to the bush that was burning, wondered why it wasn't burning out, and moved towards it, the Lord spoke to him. So the Lord meets us at the level of our fascination. Just a perspective before we move on to the core area, although I think we already addressing that, is there's a difference between penicillin and broccoli. penicillin is an intervention at a particular time to reach out and help, if you like, someone who is in desperate need for helping hand. In the Lord's words, the person who is very sick. And on the other hand, there is this broccoli area where she spent everything she had on physicians, no man could heal her, but there was something that happened within the process of life that was more significant than having a particular remedy. You follow? So there's a remedial, there's a remedy aspect, but very, very importantly, there's the ongoing relational aspect. And I really think that is important. Now, in terms of medical implications of fathering wounds, I will have a certain amount of time which I would like to be reminded of 5 minutes before, that I would just like to touch on. That may encourage you to ask questions and be invited in a conversation. Many ways to define a father wound. The closest medical description was, a father wound is a deficiency or absence of love from your birth father, whether intentional or not. Now that's a limited definition, but that is one that has been put forward in the publication arena, even in relation to medical and psychological definitions. So what can make that toxic? Well, one of the things I probably want to point out is how let's call it the medical focus, actually led to a distraction that is now being corrected. We know, and there are many books written about fatherless societies, and written by authors in this room, written by international authors, but I'd like to go back to, in a sense, the orphan maker of psychology in a certain sense, and I want to be sensitive about this, but the very first patient that Sigmund Freud treated, or at least within the context of his evolving interest, was together with another person who was the primary care doctor for that person. And this particular individual had been abused by her father. And that was the subject of the first publication that Sigmund Freud made. The medical evidence, in this case paralysis, of an example of a worst case scenario, in a certain sense, of a father-child relationship. And eventually, and we don't know necessarily why, whether it was the pressure of Austrian society, whether it was just his own deliberate disbelief, whether it was that or the other, eventually the theory changed that there was this fantasized version of a father that somehow featured in these individuals. Although in the very, very first publication, the conclusion was that an abusive, wrongful, neglectful relationship with the father had these various medical consequences. Now, the criticism of Freud is not limited to psychology. It is actually coming from the very neuropsychiatry for which he was the founder. So the dialogue is actually coming from there. And if you want to read about it, and I think just take courage in the reorientation that is happening as light is shining on many things, I would encourage you to look at that literature and take confidence from it. Now, in terms of the evidence, whether psychological wounds, adverse child events, all these things, whether they have medical consequences, I would say is really no longer a matter of debate as far as evidence is concerned. In other words, from a medical scientific point of view, the evidence is pretty clear. It's at least 20, even 30 years old in mainstream scientific publications, and you probably know this. So there's a very big study that was done and published in a very reputable journal saying that there are predictable mechanisms in which bodies fail and are significantly higher when the foundations of being anchored within a loving relationship are somehow misrepresented, which, yes, shows us in terms of what can go wrong. I look at it and say, but it's then obvious that it had or was meant to be right. So one can look at the evidence of the absence of a father, which really proves the necessity of the father, right? You know this, and I would say medicine clearly has the evidence to be able to agree, and many do. Many, many do. So there is evidence for what you're doing. And I think as a medical scientist, if you like, I would like to affirm you in what you're doing, saying it is good. It is good. Right, so the articles you can look at your leisure. The take-home message was, we found a strong, linked, in other words, got worse, relationship between the breadth, time of exposure to abuse or household dysfunction during childhood, and multiple risk factors for several of the leading causes of death in adults. And we're not talking about suicide only. We're talking about heart attacks, strokes, cancer, various things that we are almost tending to look at only medically. And it's unsustainable to fund it at the crisis level. This is what is important. We cannot make up for the failures of society by providing better hospitals and health insurance. It needs to happen in society, and you all know this. Now, from a patient point of view, I can also tell you, especially believers, the two traps that often happen is that people may be in their desire to get well and wanting to do things right. The two trenches that I have been most, or have had to help people or journey with people with, are essentially fear-faith and faith in faith. Fear-faith is where you do anything you possibly can in order to somehow get the healing, whether it's in whatever capacity it would be, running from this, running to that, not going to this, going there, but essentially checking boxes desperately to say the right prayer, see the right person, go to the best doctor. And I'm not saying that that is inappropriate. I'm just saying that that can eventually get you stuck. And the other is faith in faith, not the author of our faith, where we stand on assumptions rather than the fathering process in our lives. And then, in a way, whether it's a verse or a presumption, it can essentially distract us. It can become an idol, even though we think it is an expression of belief. So, just from my side, those are difficulties that I've faced personally in my own life, and I have often seen is something that one needs to navigate through. So, the biblical foundation. How many minutes do I have left? 10 minutes. What I'd like to leave as a foundation is something that once you see it becomes obvious, and that is how specifically fear, guilt, and shame, which is just the language we use, can sometimes influence and weaken our bodies. And I think maybe I should just start by saying that we are indeed woven together. We are literally woven together, and the weaving, if you look at it, and I can show you that material later, or you can have a look at it on your own, essentially forms into 3 layers. The 3 are one, and we have essentially our inner tubes, lungs and intestines, our outer surface, which is essentially skin and everything we interact with the environment, and the stuff, the bulk that's in between. And we call it typically endoderm, which is inner skin, ectoderm, outer skin, and mesoderm, middle skin. And from these 3 layers develop all the different organs and diversity of the body.
Now, what we have seen, and I can show you the evidence for, is that there are specific failures in these compartments based on fear, guilt, and shame. And it's not really that hard. I can show you all the evidence, but I'd like to show you the principle first. Fear essentially blocks down all the processes related to communication and regulation. You fear, you can overreact, underreact, or get frozen, but that is an ectoderm, or communication interaction challenge to the body. Shame is the resource contact point problem. You're not getting what you need, so you need to puff yourself up, or you need to hide. That is on the inside, so that's an endoderm issue. And guilt drives the inflammation related to what's in between. Let me show it to you graphically. Shame, or let me start with the fear as I did. Fear essentially paralyzes. You can do nothing from Scripture. If you remember the various verses, without me you can do nothing. You will be paralyzed. You will be in fear. All those consequences essentially influence that process information regulating system. Shame, the inside, is the receiving problem, where it doesn't get through, where you dry up. Without me, you dry up. Or your mesoderm burn up. That's where the immune things happen. That's where unresolved guilt, where unresolved self-accusation becomes autoimmunity. It really, once we see it, it's intuitive. Our language even uses those words. So let me put it to you this way, and that will be a summary for this discussion. The shame continuum, the drying up continuum, is from the moment of embarrassment, that's a reaction, to continually feeling unworthy and living in a combination of trying to hide and trying to prove that you're worth. The shame continuum. Where does it play up typically? People's guts. Irritable bowel syndrome. This, I'm going to be shamed. When you speak to people, it's about 20% of the world's population that has these dysfunctional, if you like, intestines. It's a fear of being shamed, abused, whether it's verbally, emotionally, sexually, comes in different styles. That's just an example. And there's proof of that in literature. The fear continuum, essentially from the reaction of fright right to always being an anxious person, the progression goes, it essentially deranges our communication systems in the body. And the evidence is there, including the communication to our hearts. Evident by dysrhythmias, hearts failing us because of fear. And lastly, the guilt continuum is where things burn up. From the moment of anger right through to being hostile and angry in every situation. And you know what? There's evidence not only that our bone marrow, our heart muscle, our body muscles, the mesodermal organs, there's evidence that they are inflamed. And it's an independent risk factor, for instance, for our blood clotting. We use it in idiomatic speech, in English at least. Someone's blood boiled, they were so angry. Well, guess what? That's almost exactly what happens. It starts clotting. So these things are sometimes very literal. Not to mention that it cuts off those tassels at the end of our chromosomes. Hostile individuals lose fringes on their chromosomes. It shortens the number of our days, literally, genetically. So, shame blocks our receiving ability. Fear blocks our thinking regulatory ability. And guilt immobilizes our substance or mesoderm. In the 5 minutes or so that I remain, just want to point out in the Bible, Leviticus 26, if you are outside the designed relationship with me, you will do nothing, be paralyzed with fear, be dried up with shame, or burn up with guilt. At the end, Deuteronomy 28, and now it's a mixed population that came out of Egypt and grew up together in that faith context, the same. You will really, really dry up. You will really, really not be able to do anything. You will really, really burn up. And so moving to the new covenant, we go to John 15. Abide in me. Otherwise, you can do nothing. You will dry up and you will burn up. Relational contexts are God's blueprint. So, dry up, do nothing, burn up. Our bodies are uniquely vulnerable in those areas. And I invite you to discussion. I'm going to close simply by saying that the perspective from the Lord, and this was at Mara, people had just been brought and seen the hand of the Lord bringing them out of Egypt, and now they were 3 days without bread and water, and they were in the situation, now what? In that setting of contradiction, the Lord speaks to them and says, if you will hear, listen, do, and obey, work according to what I say rather than what you see, then none of the diseases will come on you, and I am the Lord who keeps you well. I am your penicillin and your broccoli. I am anti-disease and pro-health. I deal with a problem and I work with the body. Sometimes it will be time for you to tidy your room. But don't forget that the main idea is for me to enjoy seeing you play. And I went to a lot of trouble to give you this world to do it in. I will stop there, please.